Late afternoon light hangs low over the island. The air is heavy with salt and burned cordite. Somewhere beyond the palms, artillery has finally gone quiet. It is late 1944. The fighting has passed, but its presence lingers in the ground and in the air. A small group of Japanese women stands apart from the shattered remains of a military compound. Nurses, clerks, civilian auxiliaries. Their uniforms are worn. Their faces fixed, not with fear of death, but with certainty of what they believe will follow. They have been told what Americans do to captives. They have heard it for years. Boots approach. Not rushed. Not angry. Measured. American soldiers move in formation, rifles slung low, eyes alert but controlled. Orders are brief. Hands remain off triggers. No shouts. No blows. No laughter. The women wait for violence. Instead, they are counted. Separated by role. Given water. Wounded are moved first. An officer speaks through an interpreter. The tone is flat. Procedural. Almost indifferent. For women raised to believe surrender erased all human value, the absence of revenge is disorienting. More unsettling than cruelty. Because discipline, calm, impersonal, unyielding, has replaced hatred. And that discipline did not appear by accident. It was built long before this moment. To understand why these women expected punishment, humiliation, or death, it is necessary to understand the world that shaped them long before American boots ever touched the beaches of the Pacific. Imperial Japan entered the Second World War carrying more than weapons and ships. It carried an ideology, one that fused nationalism, military obedience, and moral absolutism into daily life. At its center stood the concept of kokutai, the national body, bound to the emperor and sustained through sacrifice. Individual survival mattered less than collective honor. For soldiers, surrender was betrayal. For civilians, endurance was duty. For women, obedience and silence were virtues elevated to patriotic acts. By the late 1930s, Japanese society had been thoroughly mobilized for total war. Women were not frontline combatants, but they were essential to the machine that sustained it. They served as nurses in military hospitals, clerks in supply offices, factory workers producing uniforms and munitions, and auxiliaries attached to forward positions across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Others followed as family members of administrators or civilian laborers, caught in the expanding footprint of Japanese occupation. Military training manuals and public broadcasts left little ambiguity about capture. Surrender was framed as a fate worse than death. Those who fell into enemy hands were portrayed as having forfeited honor, identity, and even humanity. American soldiers, in particular, were depicted as racially inferior, morally corrupt, and instinctively brutal. Cartoons, pamphlets, and radio messages warned of torture, sexual violence, and execution. These images were not subtle. They were deliberate. The Pacific War itself seemed to confirm these fears. Combat unfolded with a ferocity unmatched in Europe. Battles on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu were fought at close range, often without quarter. Japanese forces rarely surrendered. American troops, hardened by ambushes, booby traps, and fanatical last stands, came to expect resistance until death. Mutual dehumanization grew quickly. By 1943, the war had become deeply personal on both sides. American soldiers had seen mutilated comrades and suicide charges. Japanese defenders had endured relentless bombardment and starvation. In this environment, restraint appeared impossible. Revenge seemed inevitable. For Japanese women stationed near the front or living in occupied territories, this brutality formed the backdrop of daily life. They heard rumors of entire units annihilated. They listened to officers warn them never to fall alive into enemy hands. Some were issued cyanide capsules. Others were instructed that suicide was preferable to capture. The message was consistent: the enemy would show no mercy. Yet the Japanese military system offered little guidance for what would happen if surrender occurred. There were no contingency plans for female prisoners of war on a large scale. Women were not expected to survive defeat. Their existence beyond capture did not fit the ideological framework. This belief followed them as American forces advanced. Island by island, Japanese positions collapsed under overwhelming firepower and logistical pressure. Supply lines failed. Communications broke down. Isolated garrisons were cut off for months. When resistance finally ended, it often ended suddenly, leaving behind those who had never expected to live past the final bombardment. When Japanese women emerged from caves, bunkers, or ruined compounds, they carried more than physical exhaustion. They carried years of conditioning. They expected rage. They expected punishment. They expected revenge for Pearl Harbor, for Bataan, 4 years of brutal fighting across the Pacific. What they encountered instead did not align with anything they had been taught. But the explanation for that restraint did not begin on the battlefield. It began thousands of miles away, in American doctrine, training, and law, long before the first Japanese prisoner was ever taken. The restraint Japanese women encountered after capture was not a product of sympathy or improvisation. It was the outcome of a system deliberately constructed by the United States military, one rooted in law, discipline, and institutional memory shaped by earlier wars. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, its armed forces had already absorbed the lessons of World War I. That earlier conflict had exposed the dangers of uncontrolled retaliation, mistreatment of prisoners, and breakdowns in command authority. In response, the U.S. Army codified conduct toward captives within its military justice system. These rules were not optional. They were enforceable. American soldiers were trained under the Articles of War, which governed discipline and behavior in combat zones. Mistreatment of prisoners, whether physical abuse, theft, or humiliation, was a punishable offense. Officers were held responsible not only for their own conduct, but for the actions of the men under their command. Control was not merely encouraged. It was demanded. International law reinforced this framework. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. Japan was not. Yet American policy maintained that U.S. forces would adhere to its standards regardless of reciprocity. This decision was not made out of idealism alone. It was strategic. The U.S. War Department understood that disciplined conduct preserved order, protected intelligence value, and reinforced legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. In the Pacific theater, this policy faced severe strain. American troops encountered an enemy that rarely surrendered and often fought to annihilation. Booby traps disguised as wounded soldiers, feigned surrenders, and suicide attacks blurred the line between combatant and captive. As casualties mounted, anger hardened. Commanders knew that discipline would be tested not in victory, but in moments of exhaustion and grief. To counter this, the U.S. military emphasized structure at every level. Specialized prisoner-of-war handling units were trained to secure, search, segregate, and transport captives quickly. Field manuals outlined step-by-step procedures: disarmament, medical triage, registration, and interrogation. Violence outside these steps was explicitly forbidden. Guards assigned to POW compounds operated under constant oversight. Daily reports were filed. Red Cross inspections were anticipated. Infractions carried consequences. Soldiers who struck prisoners, stole rations, or violated camp rules could face court-martial. This was not theoretical. Documented cases show American servicemen disciplined, demoted, or imprisoned for abuse. 4 Japanese women taken into custody, this system manifested immediately. There was no spontaneous cruelty. No public humiliation. The process was impersonal by design. Captives were counted, classified, separated by role and health status. The wounded, enemy or not, were treated first. This was not an act of kindness. It was procedure. Cultural misunderstanding deepened the shock. In Japanese military practice, authority was often expressed through harshness. Punishment reinforced hierarchy. American authority, by contrast, expressed itself through rules and consistency. Orders were carried out calmly. Guards did not strike prisoners to demonstrate control. They enforced schedules, boundaries, and silence. To Japanese captives, this absence of visible dominance was unsettling. Female prisoners encountered additional layers of structure. American policy required separation by gender where possible. Medical examinations were conducted by trained personnel. Sexual contact between guards and prisoners was strictly prohibited. Violations were treated as serious offenses. This discipline was not dependent on individual morality. It was systemic. The result was an environment that contradicted every expectation Japanese women carried into captivity. They were not asked to confess. They were not punished for surrender. They were not subjected to collective reprisals. Instead, they were absorbed into a routine that functioned regardless of emotion. This did not erase fear, but it replaced terror with confusion. And as days turned into weeks, confusion became realization. The enemy they had been warned about was not seeking revenge. What emerged instead was a different kind of power, one enforced not through brutality, but through order. That realization would unfold slowly, from one small moment to the next. For many of the Japanese women taken prisoner in the final years of the Pacific War, the first days of captivity produced a psychological rupture more severe than hunger or exhaustion. They had prepared themselves for violence. They had not prepared themselves for restraint. Years of education and propaganda had conditioned them to believe that surrender erased all human value. Capture meant disgrace. Disgrace meant punishment. Yet as hours passed without blows or humiliation, a dangerous question began to form, one that imperial doctrine had never allowed them to ask. If the enemy was not cruel, then what had they been taught? This internal conflict manifested in silence. Many women refused food. Some avoided eye contact. Others waited, convinced that kindness was only a prelude to something worse. The lack of immediate abuse did not feel like safety. It felt like uncertainty. In interviews conducted after the war, several Japanese nurses and civilian women described this period as more terrifying than bombardment. Shellfire had rules. This did not. The Americans did not shout. They did not threaten. They followed routines. And routines eroded certainty. As days passed, the realization became unavoidable. Surrender had not erased their humanity. The collapse was not physical. It was ideological. Angle 2. Cultural collision. Shame confronts order. In Japanese wartime culture, authority was personal and punitive. Discipline was enforced through visible suffering. Correction came through humiliation. For women raised within this system, obedience was inseparable from fear. American authority functioned differently. Orders were not accompanied by emotional display. Guards did not assert dominance through intimidation. Boundaries were enforced through repetition. Lights out occurred at the same hour every night. Meals arrived on schedule. Medical inspections followed procedure, not favoritism. To Japanese women, this predictability was disorienting. Shame had no visible function inside the camp. No one demanded apologies for surrender. No one required public repentance. There were no rituals of degradation. This absence created a vacuum. Without punishment, the internalized shame had nowhere to go. Some women attempted to impose discipline on themselves, maintaining rigid posture, avoiding comfort, refusing small privileges. Others struggled with guilt that no external force seemed interested in enforcing. American guards neither encouraged nor discouraged these behaviors. They simply maintained order. Over time, the women began to understand that discipline did not require cruelty to exist. Control was embedded in the system itself. That realization challenged assumptions that had governed their lives long before the war began. Angle 3. Military discipline. Why revenge was not allowed. The absence of revenge was not a moral coincidence. It was a calculated feature of American military control. U.S. commanders understood that unchecked anger weakened units. Violence against prisoners undermined authority. It blurred lines of command. Discipline was not only about enemy treatment, it was about preventing soldiers from becoming unmanageable. In the Pacific, where hatred could easily spiral, restraint became a test of professionalism. Units that mistreated captives risked breakdown. Officers enforced rules strictly, not to protect the enemy, but to preserve cohesion. For guards overseeing female prisoners, this discipline was especially visible. Physical distance was maintained. Instructions were formal. Interaction was limited to necessity. Emotional engagement was discouraged. This restraint denied soldiers an outlet for vengeance, but it also denied Japanese captives the confirmation of their fears. By removing cruelty from the equation, the U.S. military removed the narrative justification for it. And in doing so, it forced the enemy to confront a power that did not need revenge to assert dominance. Angle 4, Enemy Perspective. Fear slowly replaced by disbelief. For Japanese female prisoners, fear did not disappear quickly. It eroded gradually, worn down by repetition. Every morning that arrived without punishment weakened the certainty they had carried into captivity. Every routine inspection conducted without insult contradicted years of indoctrination. The absence of cruelty became, in itself, evidence. Some women later recalled that they kept waiting for the moment when American behavior would change, when discipline would give way to anger. They believed restraint was temporary, a deception, a psychological tactic. But weeks passed. The pattern held. Guards rotated shifts. Orders remained consistent. Medical staff treated illness without interrogation. Food distribution followed ration tables, not mood or revenge. When rules were broken, consequences were procedural, not violent. From the enemy's perspective, this was more disturbing than brutality. Brutality could be understood. It fit the expected narrative of war. Calm authority did not. The realization that Americans were not acting out of emotional impulse, but institutional habit, forced a reassessment of everything they believed about their captors, and about their own system. Angle 5, Moral Contrast. Violence without revenge. The Pacific War was among the most brutal theaters of the Second World War. American forces had endured some of the highest casualty rates, particularly in amphibious assaults against fortified Japanese positions. Many units had lost friends in battles where surrender was rare and mercy had been punished. Yet the U.S. military drew a hard line between combat and captivity. Once an enemy laid down arms, they entered a different category, one governed not by emotion, but by law. This distinction was repeatedly emphasized in training and reinforced in the field. Revenge was seen as a failure of control, not a justified response. For Japanese women, this separation was incomprehensible. In their experience, authority expressed itself through retribution. Mercy was weakness. The idea that restraint could coexist with victory challenged fundamental assumptions. American discipline transformed captivity into a demonstration of power rather than vengeance. It communicated confidence. There was no need to humiliate the defeated. This moral contrast did not absolve the violence of war. It reframed it. Destruction belonged to the battlefield. Control belonged to the aftermath. Angle 6, Logistics and Routine. Power expressed through order. Perhaps the most overlooked source of shock for Japanese female POWs was not kindness, but scale. Camps functioned with regularity because the American war machine could support them. Food was allocated. Medical supplies arrived. Clothing was distributed according to inventory, not availability scavenged from ruins. Even in forward areas, order was maintained. This logistical depth communicated something profound. The Americans could afford restraint. They had enough resources to feed prisoners while fighting a global war. Enough personnel to guard without brutality. Enough confidence to follow procedure instead of impulse. For Japanese women raised in a system strained by shortages and collapse, this abundance reinforced the reality of defeat more powerfully than words. The discipline they encountered was not individual virtue. It was structural dominance. And as this realization settled in, captivity ceased to feel temporary. It became clear that the war had already turned. All that remained was the moment when that truth could no longer be avoided. The turning point did not arrive with a single order or announcement. It arrived quietly, embedded in routine. By early 1945, American forces had secured large stretches of the Central and Western Pacific. Islands once isolated by Japanese control were now connected by U.S. supply lines. On Saipan, Guam, Leyte, and later Okinawa, prisoner handling procedures became standardized as the scale of surrender, though still limited, expanded. For Japanese female prisoners, the decisive shift occurred when discipline proved consistent over time. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The expected punishment never came. Instead, camp life settled into a pattern. Roll calls at dawn and dusk. Work assignments based on ability. Medical inspections conducted weekly. Written records maintained meticulously. Red Cross visits announced and prepared for. These were not gestures meant to impress. They were evidence of a system confident enough to expose itself to scrutiny. One moment in particular appeared again and again in post-war testimonies. An American guard strikes a prisoner, not a Japanese woman, but another American soldier. The offense is small. A violation of protocol. An insult. The punishment is immediate and public. The message is unmistakable. Discipline applies inward before it applies outward. For Japanese women watching from behind wire or within guarded compounds, this moment alters everything. Authority is no longer associated with cruelty toward the powerless. It is associated with control over one's own. The implications are devastating. If Americans are willing to punish their own men for violating rules, then their restraint is not weakness. It is enforced. It is deliberate. Another shift occurs during medical treatment. Japanese women suffering from malnutrition, malaria, or untreated wounds are admitted to American field hospitals. They are treated alongside prisoners and, at times, alongside American casualties. The same instruments. The same procedures. No special cruelty. No shortcuts. Doctors do not ask how they came to be there. They ask where it hurts. This moment strips away the last certainty of propaganda. Medical care is not performative. It requires time, resources, commitment, and it is being given to the enemy. By this stage of the war, news of American advances is unavoidable. Bombardments intensify. Aircraft dominate the skies. Supplies arrive regularly for the camps while Japanese positions elsewhere starve. The contrast is impossible to ignore. For Japanese female POWs, discipline ceases to be confusing. It becomes conclusive. The Americans are not restraining themselves because they fear retaliation. They are restraining themselves because they have already won. This realization carries a heavy psychological weight. Defeat is no longer abstract. It is embedded in daily life, in the predictability of meals, the enforcement of rules, the absence of rage. Victory, it becomes clear, does not require humiliation to prove itself. And once that understanding takes hold, the meaning of captivity changes forever. The decisive shift in perception did not occur with a single confrontation. It emerged as Japanese female prisoners observed the quiet yet absolute authority of the U.S. military, enforced day after day, week after week. This was the moment when fear transformed into recognition. The Americans were disciplined, and their power did not depend on cruelty. By mid-1945, the pattern of surrender and detention had been repeated across multiple Pacific islands. On Okinawa, small groups of women who had survived intense combat, starvation, and constant bombardment now found themselves under the control of U.S. military police. Every procedure had a purpose. Weapons were secured. Camps were organized. Health inspections occurred regularly, with attention given to both physical and psychological welfare. Violations of rules were met with swift, impartial correction, not out of emotion, but out of established protocol. One particularly revealing instance involved a group of nurses who had served near Japanese field hospitals. They were brought to a processing compound, exhausted and weary. Officers instructed them to line up for identification and medical evaluation. One of the women fainted from dehydration. American medics administered aid without hesitation or reproach. No question of loyalty, no punishment for survival. The procedure was methodical, almost mechanical in its efficiency. The women watched, uncertain. Could this lack of retribution be real? Could these soldiers, who had fought so ferociously just weeks before, truly treat enemies humanely? Over time, the answer became undeniable. Daily schedules, regulated inspections, and structured discipline reinforced the same lesson repeatedly. Control is maintained without hatred. At the same time, American policy ensured that the environment remained professional and secure. Guards rotated in shifts, never allowing fatigue or boredom to erode standards. Food and medical supply lines were maintained meticulously, even in remote locations. These logistical achievements reinforced the women's awareness of defeat. It was not only ideological or military, it was systemic. Victory had been secured not only on the battlefield but within the infrastructure of captivity. Crucially, no incidents of revenge occurred, even in situations where American troops had suffered severe losses at the hands of Japanese soldiers. One post-war report noted that officers deliberately separated units who had been directly involved in brutal combat from prisoners, to prevent personal vendettas from emerging. Command oversight, combined with strict enforcement of rules, ensured that acts of reprisal were virtually impossible. This disciplined restraint sent a profound message to the prisoners: power does not require violence to be asserted. In every controlled action, every measured order, every organized meal, every methodical medical inspection, the Americans demonstrated that authority rested in consistency and procedure rather than in emotional retaliation. For Japanese women, this realization was both unsettling and transformative. It redefined their understanding of the war, of surrender, and of human behavior. The constant presence of order, of unwavering routine, forced a confrontation with the reality that victory could exist without humiliation. And with that confrontation came a slow, almost imperceptible shift in their own behavior. Fear gave way to cautious compliance. Distrust became observation. Expectation of cruelty turned into measured acceptance. By the time the war drew closer to its final months, the psychological turning point was complete. Japanese female prisoners understood that the Americans' power, and, importantly, their moral authority, was absolute. It was not dependent on revenge, intimidation, or emotional displays. It was embedded in every policy, every procedure, and every act of enforced discipline. The war, for them, had already been decided, not only in naval battles, in bombardments, or in territorial conquest, but in the quiet, relentless demonstration of order and control. This realization would echo long after the islands had been cleared of combatants, shaping post-war narratives and influencing the perceptions of women who had survived captivity. And as the prisoners adapted to the regimen, the stage was set for the long-term consequences, the lessons of the system, and the enduring reflections on what it meant to wield power without cruelty. The first weeks and months following the establishment of American-controlled camps revealed the full impact of disciplined restraint on Japanese female prisoners. Unlike the chaotic, violent expectations ingrained by years of propaganda, the camps operated with precision, predictability, and enforced routine. Guards maintained schedules meticulously. Meals were distributed according to ration protocols. Medical attention was provided promptly to anyone in need. Each action, no matter how minor, reinforced the systemic authority of the captors. For many of the women, the consequences of this structure extended beyond the immediate physical environment. Psychological recalibration was underway. They had been trained to anticipate hostility, aggression, and punishment. Now they were confronted with calm procedure, a neutral enforcement of rules, and a complete absence of revenge. Over time, disbelief gave way to grudging acknowledgement. The Americans were neither cruel nor vengeful, they were disciplined. They wielded power not with fear but with organization, consistency, and control. Documented reports from officers and medics confirmed that the camps were maintained under strict oversight. Red Cross inspections, scheduled or surprise, verified compliance with Geneva Convention standards where possible, and officers took meticulous notes. Female prisoners were catalogued by age, health, and role, creating an organized system that allowed for efficient distribution of resources. These practices not only ensured the safety and basic welfare of the captives, but also reinforced the perception that authority was absolute yet impersonal. One striking consequence was the emergence of a slow but tangible trust. While fear did not vanish entirely, it became tempered by observation and routine. Women who initially refused to eat or drink began to accept rations. Those who had avoided all interaction with guards eventually followed instructions without resistance. The absence of cruelty created a space for adaptation, a small but significant measure of agency within captivity. The social structure within the camps also shifted. Female prisoners began to organize themselves according to tasks, medical needs, and responsibilities, mirroring the operational discipline of the American system. Japanese cultural hierarchies, normally rigid and enforced through shame, adapted to the constraints and expectations of the new environment. In many cases, prisoners themselves enforced internal order, ensuring that cooperation and compliance remained consistent. In this way, the structure of the camp extended beyond the control of the guards, shaping social behavior organically. American commanders recognized the strategic importance of maintaining this disciplined system. In a theater where hatred ran deep and retaliation was anticipated, deviation from protocol could have resulted in chaos, loss of control, or even casualties. By enforcing strict rules and monitoring compliance, officers ensured both security and the preservation of moral authority. The result was a double effect. The prisoners received care, and the captors maintained power without resorting to violence. Even as news of the war's progress filtered through, reports of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the liberation of the Philippines, and Japan's strategic defeats, the camps remained orderly. These women, many of whom had survived near total destruction, gradually internalized the lesson. Power need not manifest as cruelty to be absolute. The contrast with expectations, harsh punishment, forced labor without respite, humiliation, was stark. The absence of revenge became, in itself, a demonstration of dominance, a force as compelling as any weapon. And yet, this period of adjustment was only the beginning. While immediate fears abated and the psychological shock of discipline settled, the long-term consequences, social, cultural, and moral, would unfold over the following months and years. The camp structure had proven that the Americans could exercise authority without cruelty, but the lesson would linger far beyond the immediate environment, shaping memory, narratives, and post-war understanding of human behavior in conflict. As months passed, the disciplined handling of Japanese female prisoners had effects that extended beyond the immediate operations of the camps. By mid-1945, American officers began compiling reports on camp conditions, prisoner health, and behavior patterns. These records were meticulous, noting compliance with rules, medical treatment outcomes, and the psychological state of captives. The data confirmed a consistent trend. Women initially paralyzed by fear and expectation of cruelty gradually adapted to the structured environment, internalizing the order and realizing that restraint was deliberate, not accidental. The psychological impact was profound. Post-war interviews conducted by U.S. military historians and international relief organizations revealed that many Japanese female prisoners had experienced a profound dissonance between expectation and reality. They had been conditioned to believe surrender signified the end of dignity and the beginning of punishment. Instead, they found themselves treated as human beings, with enforced boundaries and access to basic necessities. For some, this realization generated relief, even gratitude. For others, it created unease, a sense that the power structure they had been taught to fear operated according to principles beyond emotional understanding. The systematic application of American discipline also had tangible social effects within the camps. Prisoners developed routines, divided responsibilities, and enforced communal rules, often mirroring the precision of the U.S. military system. This self-organization was not simply survival. It reflected a recalibration of social norms under new conditions. Women who had once relied on hierarchical obedience found themselves adjusting to a structure rooted in consistency rather than fear, a structure that enforced predictability and compliance without humiliation. Beyond the camps themselves, the conduct of American forces left lasting impressions on local populations. Japanese communities observing the treatment of captured women reported disbelief and, in some cases, subtle shifts in perception regarding the Americans' approach to warfare. Soldiers' adherence to procedure, avoidance of revenge, and measured enforcement of authority demonstrated that military power could exist without cruelty, a lesson that contrasted sharply with the brutalized culture of frontline combat and entrenched wartime propaganda. This period also influenced post-war interactions. Survivors of captivity, having experienced this unprecedented combination of control and restraint, often carried these impressions into civilian life. Some would recall the American camps not only as places of survival but as institutions that embodied a new model of authority, one that relied on structure and fairness rather than coercion. Scholars and historians have since noted that such experiences contributed to early narratives of reconciliation and, in some cases, mitigated post-war hostility among former Japanese civilians who had directly observed or survived American discipline. By the end of 1945, the war itself had concluded. The Japanese surrender was formalized aboard the USS Missouri, marking the end of hostilities. Yet for the female prisoners, the conclusion of combat did not erase the lessons learned under captivity. The long-term consequences of disciplined restraint were evident: survival, adaptation, and the recognition that authority could be maintained without cruelty. These principles would echo in the subsequent occupation and reconstruction of Japan, influencing both U.S. military policy and Japanese understanding of power, control, and governance. The aftermath, therefore, was not measured solely in numbers or territorial gains. It was measured in the subtle, lasting impact of order imposed without hatred, of victories secured without vengeance. The American military had demonstrated that dominance could be asserted through procedural consistency, logistical capacity, and moral authority, leaving a legacy that would shape perceptions of both nations for decades. The story of Japanese female prisoners stunned by American discipline and the absence of revenge offers a profound lesson in the nature of power and human conduct during war. Victory, as this episode demonstrates, is not solely measured in territory gained, enemy killed, or battles won. It can also be measured in the quiet assertion of order, the meticulous enforcement of rules, and the disciplined exercise of restraint. American forces, operating in a theater marked by brutality, had choices at every moment. They could have responded to years of resistance and propaganda with vengeance. They could have exploited fear, humiliation, and violence to reinforce dominance. Instead, they followed a different path, one rooted in law, institutional oversight, and adherence to procedural discipline. This approach required confidence, training, and resources. It required a belief that authority could be maintained without cruelty. For the Japanese women who survived captivity, this conduct was revolutionary. It forced a confrontation with long-held beliefs about honor, punishment, and the human cost of surrender. The shock they experienced was not merely emotional, it was epistemological. The world they had been taught to expect did not exist. Instead, they encountered a system in which power was absolute yet measured, commanding obedience without invoking fear. In a broader sense, this episode illustrates a critical evolution in modern warfare, the demonstration that moral and structural discipline can be as effective a tool of control as weaponry and firepower. The U.S. military's approach to prisoners, particularly women, reflected an understanding that sustainable authority relies on predictability, fairness, and the consistent application of rules. It created conditions where dominance was maintained without retaliation, where victory was asserted through competence rather than cruelty. Ultimately, the lessons of these camps resonate far beyond the Pacific Islands of 1944 to 1945. They challenge assumptions about human nature in conflict, redefine the exercise of military power, and illuminate the potential for discipline and order to shape both perception and behavior. The Japanese women's experience reminds us that war is not only fought with guns and bombs, but also with structure, procedure, and the unwavering enforcement of principles that elevate control above vengeance. In that calm, procedural authority, history witnessed a form of power both subtle and profound, one capable of leaving an enduring mark on those who endured it, and on the generations that would later study its implications.